When I became a parent of little kids, I read all the books you're supposed to read, on parenting. I read them all, and the importance in parenting of a good discipline, the importance in parenting of a solid routine, the importance in parenting of certain techniques to motivate your kids to be good and to do. Have very, very clear disciplinary processes, and I found that very insightful until I had kids. And I have come to believe over the years when I was a parent of young kids that the ultimate technique, the one that worked the best, was blackmail. In the sense of that often it's kind of like Archimedes once wrote, "Give me a lever and I can move the world." And the same is true for parenting. If you have the right lever, the right reward, or the right threat, that might move kids to behave in certain ways. And so part of parenting is figuring out what motivates your kids. And that sounds, I'll be honest, a little cynical. Don't judge me. I'm a scarred veteran of the wars, I promise you. I lived through the Civil War of the teenage years. I know you grandparents are smirking, but y'all waved the flag a long time ago. You even switched sides, I think. But this idea of a lever, of some reward and or punishment in order to motivate our kids to do things, I actually think the season of Advent, this season leading up to Christmas, is all about that for a lot of parents, right? Who doesn't use the season of Christmas in anticipation of motivating the kids? Hey, don't judge me, because I lived through the days when I couldn't get my kid to brush his teeth, my son to brush his teeth. I couldn't get my daughter not to wear her princess dress for 4 days in a row. You trying to find some way to motivate them to do well. And Advent and Christmas kind of goes like that. And if you think about it, one of my favorite songs from Christmas, if you think about it, what is it? Santa Claus is coming to town. Have you ever listened to the words of that? How does it go? You better not... You better watch out, you better not pout, you better not cry. Why? Because Santa Claus is coming to town. And it gets even worse. He's making a list, he's making it twice. See who's naughty and nice, right? And then it gets even creepier, right? If you think about it, he sees you when you're sleeping, he sees you when you're awake. And let's be honest, what parent hasn't threatened Santa Claus may not show up at one's house in terms of motivating the kids to behave, particularly in the sugar high of Christmas. So I mean, that's a kind of funny thing to reflect on. But what struck me as I thought about that is, the church has used that same motivation over and over again, right? You think about it. Even in the season of Advent, Jesus is coming. And in fact, the season of Advent is kind of an anticipation that, in fact, much of the scripture lessons that are used during the season of Advent in the lectionary are often pointing to the second coming of Christ. And the idea basically is Jesus is coming to town, right? You better watch out, you better not pout, you better not cry. Jesus is coming to town. He knows who's been naughty and nice. Jesus is coming to town. And let's be truthful, in many ways, the church has used that idea to motivate Christians to behave. My absolute favorite bumper sticker, I've looked for this, I've got to find it, that I saw many, many years ago. It said, "Jesus is coming. Look busy." Well, that's the idea. Sometimes our busyness of trying to to do things. In many ways, the faith, the tradition, the religion is about, earning points to get to heaven or health insurance or some kind of motivation that's moving us to do certain things in anticipation of Jesus' arrival. And I've often thought about that. That's kind of messed up, isn't it? Is the season of Advent, which is a word that means coming, is a season of preparation and anticipation. It seems to be a season in which we spend a lot of time, preparing for Christmas. And when Christmas arrives, everything kind of gets packed up. And there's a sense in which, supposedly in the church, the season of Advent is a time we prepare ourselves for the arrival of Jesus in the birth narrative. Or in other parts of our tradition, the arrival of Jesus in some far future. And what's challenging about that as a motivation to be people of faith, what's challenging about that is there is actually a significant part of our Christian tradition, a kind of mystical part of our tradition, theological and biblical, that says Jesus isn't just in the future, he's now. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the world was not created without the Word. I've always, I don't know about you, been puzzled about that, because that's the very beginning of the gospel. Before the birth of Jesus, there is an assertion within our tradition in which the Word is already present in creation around us. In fact, creation around us, you and me, the Word, we would not have been made without the Word. And it's an odd Greek word. In fact, we have a trouble kind of trying to understand it. It's a Greek word that was used by philosophers. It was a word called logos, which could be translated as word, or it could be translated as reason, or speech, or wisdom, or as some Greek philosophers, the generative principle. The logos, as Richard Rohr recently described it as the divine pattern. The assertion is not that the Word will come sometime in the future, but the Word is already a part of everything. And how do we make sense of that in this season of Advent? In anticipation for the birth of Jesus. Those concepts don't kind of connect. They seem very separate. But in truth, they are very much interconnected. There's an old Jewish story, a Jewish mystical story, that says at the beginning, when God said, "Let there be light," out flowed from God with these 10 vessels, these 10 lanterns of divine light that were sent into the darkness to form the world and the cosmos in divine union and beauty. But these vessels, according to Jewish tradition, were so fragile they couldn't contain the divine light, and so they broke apart. And divine sparks spread all over the cosmos and the world. And that the task of those who believe in the light, who believe in the Logos, our task is what's called tikkun olam, to repair the world. And that our task as believers and followers of God is that we are to connect the divine light we find scattered around us and connect it again until one day The divine light will be one. Our job, tikkun olam, is to repair the world. And the radicalness of this idea is that every time you say a prayer, you are collecting a little bit of the light. Every time you show some kindness to your neighbor, you're collecting a little piece of that light and bringing it together. You're repairing the world. Even coming this Sunday morning, what you're doing is you're collecting the light and repairing the world. When we forgive another person, when we connect to a stranger, when we do an act of justice, when we do the small, simple things, it's not being busy, it's doing the work that God calls us to do. Because the light, according to the Gospel of John, is all around us and everywhere, and our job is to bring it together. The pieces scattered throughout our world. Now, my favorite poet, is a man named Christian Wyman. Has anybody ever heard of Christian Wyman? He wrote a book called My Bright Abyss, Memoirs of a Modern Believer. And Christian Wyman, he was born and grew up in a dusty West Texas town, and describes that as a young man, I think he was about 15 years old, he had this profound experience, a kind of altar call, which is does anybody here know what an altar call is? If you come from the South, an altar call is this moment after the sermon when you're supposed to come forward and be saved. Christian Wyman had this experience. He was the church he grew up in and had this profound, deeply spiritual experience of God and Jesus Christ. And as he tells us, his story unfolds as it moves along, he begins over the years to kind of lose touch with that experience. He goes off to college, he studies, he becomes more of an academic, and he becomes what he would describe as agnostic at best, probably at worst an atheist. He described this sense in which he never really reflected on faith anymore. It was just a part of his past. And he began to become well known as a poet. And poetry, in many ways, was the light that fed his soul. Poetry, in many ways, was how he was able to see the world. And then in his 30s, two things happened that kind of transformed him. The first was he just met his wife, who he married, and it was this really surprising experience of someone he'd met, who he recognized and saw himself in, someone he could love. And he found this incredible love that was so meaningful for his life in his early 30s. So that was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was that he was diagnosed with an untreatable cancer. That ultimately could not be fixed. So within a span of a few years, he meets the love of his life, this profound, meaningful experience, and then this devastating news. And Wyman describes this sense of his faith and how it became a central part of how he began to face the world. It became a central part of the questions he had for God, of searching for the light. He says, well, at 50, I don't have the same faith as I did when I was 15. In fact, he said, if you have the same faith at 50 that you had at 15, then you haven't let life impact you. But he began this meaningful journey in his poetry to describe, in his writing and prose, to describe this very powerful experience of God's presence. The light of Christ around him. And I'm going to read a little bit of a section of one thing he wrote, because one of the issues he wrestled with, he says, in modern times, one of the things we wrestle with is the absence of God. And he writes, God is not absent. God is everywhere in the world. We are too. To feel God, to find God, does not usually require that we renounce all worldly possessions, enter a monastery. To feel God, to find God, does not mean we have to give our lives over to some cause of social justice or create some sort of sacred art or begin spontaneously speaking in tongues. All too often, the task to which we are called is simply to show a kindness to the irritating person in the cubicle next to us. Say, we are called to touch the face of a spouse from whom we ourselves have been long absent. What we are called to is let grace wake love from our intense, self-enclosed sleep and darkness. Advent isn't simply preparing for fear or out of motivation. Advent is a time when we fully see the light already present all around us and in us. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.